Welcome to the proposed changes for the ACCME Standards commercial support for the CME Coalition. We're very happy to have everyone here today, and we have some exciting information to share with you about what the ACCME has proposed in their new name, the ACCME Standards for Integrity and Independence in Accredited Education. A couple of webinar instructions. Except for the panelists, everyone will be on mute except for the panelists. So if you try to say something, please note that we won't hear you. If you have any questions, we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the program by pressing the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen. And in addition, and if it's possible, when you submit a question, if you can submit the slide number that we discussed, if you happen to be at that point, just so we can, and when we answer the question, can go back to where the slide is. So I'd like to introduce our panelists to you. I'm Thomas Sullivan. I'm the president of Rockpoint. We're a medical education company. I'm also the editor of Policy and Medicine that many of you read, or policymed.com. And I'm the founder of the CME Coalition and work very actively with the CME Coalition on a lot of our activities. Our other panelists include Michael Lemon. Michael is the president of the Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, or PIM. He has 23 years of experience in continuing healthcare education. He is a certified healthcare CPD professional and has been the past president of the National Association of Medical Education Companies and recognized as a fellow by the Alliance for Continuing Education in the Health Professions. He earned his MBA degree from the University of Denver, Daniels College of Business in Colorado. Also with us today is Jan Schultz. Jan is a healthcare CPD professional that's career spans over 30 years in a variety of settings. She's a nurse and a master's in nursing, and just has been at this a long time. She spent 16 years at the director level in medical education companies, including 12 years with PIM, where she was director of education and outcomes and accreditation. In that position, she led PIM Outcomes Measurement Department, as well as maintaining as many as 13 accreditations. So she's an expert on accreditation, and has been actively involved in both the Alliance and the Colorado Regional CPD Organization, or the Colorado Alliance for CME, and she currently serves on the board of directors for the Alliance. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The views expressed in this webinar represent the individual views of the presenters and not necessarily reflect the opinions and positions or policy of their respective organizations that they work for, the membership organizations that they participate in, and should not be interpreted or relied upon as legal advice. And Jan is representing herself as a CPD professional and not as the ACHP, its board of directors, or any accrediting body in this webinar. So let me give you a little background for those who are new and are unfamiliar about the CME Coalition. The CME Coalition was established in 2011. We have been the CME's voice in Washington. I'm actually sitting right here, kind of over in the Capitol as we speak. We have 45 plus member organizations representing CME providers, medical societies, patient organizations, healthcare providers, and commercial supporters. We advocate on several issues with policymakers, including Congress. We work with Congress on several issues, trying to make sure that CME stays in the forefront as a valuable tool for clinicians when they to be able to learn about new government programs, including things like MIPS. We work with CMS to include an improvement activity under MIPS. So if clinicians take CME activities, they now can get credit for that, plus some improvement activity that they do, under the MIPS program. And we work with the FDA. We cooperate with various stakeholder groups to try to make sure that CME is kept front and center in the conversation. Members of the CME Coalition receive policy analysis on a very regular basis about what's happening in healthcare policy in Washington, D.C. And we also provide compliance support to our members, and including right now, we're working on a very detailed compliance guide for legal departments on how to implement CME, including things like anti-kickback, False Claims Act, FDA regulations, and Stark rules. So look forward to that coming out in the next month or so. So at this point, I'm going to hand over the rest of the presentation to Michael. So Michael.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. And everybody, thank you for the invitation and the ability to participate today. As many of you are aware, the current standards were first published in 1992, fully revised in 2004 with the most notable change to identify and resolve conflicts of interest, and then a few minor changes since then. The purpose of the standards is to ensure that CME activities are independent of commercial influence and separate from industry marketing. It's really this independence and integrity that makes CME CME. As many of you are aware, other accrediting organizations such as ACPE, ANCC, and Joint Accreditation have mostly adopted the ACCME standards, thereby making them the gold standard by which independence of continuing healthcare education is governed. Next slide. Before we begin today, we wanted to make it clear and highlight that we're not here today to provide interpretation of the intent of the standards or how to implement them. Rather, our purpose today is to inform participants of the changes and raise some issues we see with wording that may be problematic to providers and/or supporters, and encourage you to submit comments. As we all know, this is an incredibly important document designed to uphold and protect the integrity and independence of accredited education. Therefore, we are asking that you invest the time to digest the proposed standards and submit your comments. I see we've moved forward to the next slide. So our call to action with you is to submit your own comments prior to 5 p.m. Central on February 21. And I'd like to first applaud the ACCME and its task force on its efforts to streamline and integrate its policies and definitions into the standards as one document. As a general overview as we begin, the proposed standards include some new terminology and requirements. They also provide more clarity on who can and cannot be accredited or control the content of accredited continuing education activities. Stay tuned as there's more to come on this new accredited continuing education terminology. The standards have also been reduced from 5 to 6. And again, the intent is for the policies, definitions, and standards to all be in one document. Next slide. So the ACCME process of revision began with the establishment of a task force of various stakeholders, including accredited providers, the public, and ACCME leadership, who engaged our community through a call for comment in 2019. On behalf of the coalition and others, I'd like to thank all of you for your effort and time that you invested into this process. So from a next steps perspective, our community will submit comments by February 21st. Again, we ask that you do that. The ACCME Board of Directors will review these responses at its March meeting. And then after the board makes modifications and adopts the revised standards, ACCME will release a transition plan to our community. Meanwhile, and I think it's important to recognize that the current standards will remain in place and providers should continue to adhere to them. Next slide. As Tom mentioned earlier in his introduction, the standards have been renamed to better reflect the scope and extent of the standards. And again, the proposed new name is the ACCME Standards for Integrity and Independence in Accredited Continuing Education. Next slide. So the proposed standards include new terms to define organizations that are eligible for accreditation, formerly called commercial interests. Organizations are now defined as either eligible or non-eligible to be accredited or involved with the planning, development, and implementation of accredited continuing education. Updated lists of organizations that are eligible and ineligible have also been included to provide additional clarity on the types of organizations that cannot be accredited or participate in the development of accredited continuing education in roles such as a joint provider, for example. Jan will cover this in greater detail shortly. Also, the term mitigate replaces resolve with reference to actions taken related to handling conflicts of interest. However, I think it's important to highlight here that there is no change in intent. Rather, it's just a new term whereby mitigate replaces resolve. the term accredited continuing education replaces continuing medical education to be inclusive of all health professions and to clearly differentiate between accredited and non-accredited providers and education. I'd now like to pass it off to Jan to provide a deeper dive into the types of organizations that can and cannot be accredited, and she'll also highlight the changes to Standards 1 and 2. Jan?
Thank you, Michael. And I too would like to thank all of you for attending this webinar, and thank you to the Coalition for the opportunity to be a panelist. So let's take a deeper dive into the terms eligible and ineligible entities. Eligible entities are those that can be an accredited provider or be a non-accredited joint provider, as Michael indicated, for continuing accredited or for accredited continuing education. Even I stumble with the new terminology. I think an important point to highlight here is the intent is that only eligible organizations can control content, as Michael indicated, by being planners or faculty. ACCME is providing more clarity as to the types of organizations that would be eligible to provide or jointly provide accredited CE. These broad types now include those providing clinical services to patients or the education of healthcare professionals, serving as a fiduciary to patients, the public, or the population health, and other organizations that are not otherwise ineligible. And for the first time, they're providing an expanded list of those that are eligible. They had a brief list in the past, but now it's a more explicit list, if you will. And there are some new members of this list and some greater clarity. They've spelled out in terms of providing clinical services, they've spelled out more examples of what those might be, in addition to hospitals and group practices and so forth. Note that under diagnostic laboratories, which have been on the list for a while, there is a caveat here that only diagnostic laboratories that do not sell proprietary products are eligible. Electronic health records companies are specifically called as eligible this time in this version. Health law firms are also added to the list, as well as infusion centers, pharmacies. Big addition from the provider perspective, provider community, and especially from the joint accreditation community, I think. Those of you who are doing team-based learning. In the past, the ACCME did not recognize, and in fact said that pharmacies were ineligible for accreditation or control of content, and individuals who were employed by pharmacies were not were banned from controlling content. So adding pharmacies is a big win, and please note that may be a big win based on comments that were submitted in early 2019 on the existing standards. So thank you for those of you who commented. Publishing and education companies have always been eligible, but they're listed here specifically. Software and game developers, that's a new one as well. And the last one on the list, technology or data management companies, non-healthcare related, are new to the list. Please note that that ACCME and all other accreditors vet organizations in the accreditation process. They vet your organizational structure and ownership, et cetera. And of course, all accreditation bodies reserve the right to the final decision of who is not eligible or ineligible for accreditation. Next slide. This slide covers those who are ineligible to become accredited, and for the first time gives a list of the types of companies that or entities that cannot serve as to be in control of content. So, and this also contains a slightly revised definition of what we used to call the definition of a commercial interest. It's now the definition of an ineligible entities. And as you can see on the slide, it says entities that are ineligible to be accredited in the ACCME system are organizations whose primary business, and the use of the word primary, the insertion of primary is new here, is the primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products. In the past, used on or by patients. In the past, in the previous definition, this said healthcare goods or services consumed by or used on patients. So this is just a cleaner wording of the, and cleanup of less words to express, we believe, the same intent. Examples of such organizations include, and again, this is a new list, so you might want to take a look at it. Advertising, marketing, and communication firms. There are very few new members of this list, by the way. Most of us have known for a while that these companies or entities are ineligible, but this is just adding clarity. Biomedical startups that have begun an approval process through the FDA. One question we would have here, as we look at it, is there sufficient knowledge within the CPD, healthcare CPD community to know all of the various ways that items are, or that products are approved? We certainly, most of us know the pharmaceutical approval process, but what about medical devices or combination products or clinical laboratory assays? They're different processes, and if you work in those various things, you will need to become familiar with the FDA process. And once a company has a product that begins this process, that company becomes ineligible to control content. Compounding pharmacies that manufacture proprietary compounds, so not necessarily all compounding pharmacies, but those that manufacture proprietary compounds. Device manufacturers and distributors obviously would be on this list. Diagnostic labs, you'll notice that they were on the other list as well, but here's the reverse of that caveat. Diagnostic labs that market or sell proprietary products cannot control content. And this next one is interesting, especially to those of us in Colorado and California and Oregon and Washington and a few other states. Growers, distributors, or sellers of medical foods or dietary supplements. Obviously, the growers part is probably a reference to cannabis, but the distributors or sellers of medical foods and dietary supplements and medical foods have been considered commercial interests by ACCME and other accreditors for some time, but this really spells it out and also takes it back to the grower-producer level. Pharmaceutical companies or distributors, obviously. Pharmacy benefit managers have also been on the list for some time, but it spells it out here. Reagent manufacturers. And then the last one, manufacturers of health-related wearable products. That seems to be a bit vague, and that may be vague by intent, given that this is a rapidly evolving digital space, or space in our economy. Please note that below the highlight of owners, I did that highlight. It is not in the original draft. The owners are listed here as ones who cannot be accredited, but our concern is what defines an owner. If you go beyond sole proprietors or partners, to what degree of ownership are we talking about? Is it stock or option ownership of a majority, or we think, or is it any stock outside of a mutual fund? We think this needs some greater clarity, perhaps not necessarily in the standards, but certainly in FAQs or in the education that follows. Next slide. So, hold on a second here, catching up. Standard 1, this is about ensuring content validity. Again, the content that's here most of it is not new. It's just rolling the policy on content validity and or guidance documents that have been issued by ACCME in the past couple of years, dealing with controversial content into new requirements within this standard. By controversial content, we're talking about marijuana, cannabis medicine, but we're also talking about some forms of alternative or complementary medicine for which the scientific base is not firm, and for any type of medical care for which the scientific base is in solid dispute. So we're not necessarily talking about off-label use if there's sufficient science to back it up, but anything that cannot be supported by rigorous studies would fall into this group. And there's a new requirement here that that the provider and the content must not advocate for these approaches, or teach healthcare professionals how or when to use them. The ACCME has adopted this position. This is the same position that AAFP took earlier in 2019. The ACCME has now adopted that. So you can't talk about dosing. You can't talk about on which patients something that is controversial should be used. Only to inform. And 1.5, the first part of the sentence here talks about organizations and eligibility. And this is a section about content. So it would appear that comments might be welcome here around cleaning this up to really talk about what they're trying to do. And we think that they're trying to incorporate the need for scientific rigor and in studies, and also to make sure the last part of the sentence that you cannot advocate or include content about practices that have risks or dangers that outweigh the benefits or are known to be ineffective in the treatment of patients. Now back to Michael to talk about Standard 2.
Thanks, Jan. So on the next slide actually gets Standard 3. Were you going to cover this slide, Jan?
Oh, I can, excuse me, I can do that. I can do that. Yes, I can do that. Okay, so this slide, the Standard 2, is about preventing marketing and sales or accredited continuing education. And this is a new requirement for ACCME. It's not a new requirement for those of you who have been involved in nursing continuing education, as it's been an ANCC requirement for some time. Faculty must not promote or sell products or services that serve their professional or financial interests during an accredited activity. So what are they talking about here? They're talking about people who have a book and say, and are talking about, their book or and advising people to buy it. They're talking about content where faculty might be from a tertiary medical center and advocating for referral of patients to their center or to a specific practice. So those kinds of things would no longer be allowed if in accredited CE content. Also, the accredited provider. This is a new one, and we think needs some clarification and is somewhat problematic. The accredited provider must not share the names and contact information of learners with any ineligible entities or their agents without explicit consent of the individual learner each time the data is to be shared. This consent must include the name of the ineligible entity receiving the learner information and describe how the entity intends to use the information. So the question is, what's a learner? Is a learner a person who is an actual participant in the educational activity? Or is the learner someone who attends an annual meeting? We think that there needs to be more clarity in this regard. Most of us have not shared names of learners, of those who actually participate in an activity for some time, especially those of us, for instance, in nursing who have not been allowed to do that for some time. But this could be an issue if learner has a broader context, especially for those of you who do annual meetings or meetings, any kind of meetings with exhibits, where you have the practice of sharing an attendee list with names and either contact information or even just city location with commercial interests or with your exhibitors. Okay, I think now we're on to next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So in addition to replacing resolve with mitigate, Standard 3 requires providers to collect disclosure information from everyone in a position to control content about all, and I want to highlight all, financial relationships with ineligible entities in the last 12 months, as opposed to historically collecting only their relationships with commercial interests related to the content of the CE activity. So again, and importantly, this change makes it clear that it's the responsibility of the accredited provider to determine which relationships are relevant, which we believe has always been the case. However, it makes it very clear that it's the provider's responsibility. And it also further codifies that steps taken to mitigate the relationships must match the individual's role in the activity, whether he or she is a planner, faculty, or a reviewer. So for example, steps for planners will likely be different than for faculty and would occur before planning begins. Again, I think this just provides additional clarity. Next slide. So the clarification that owners or employees of ineligible entities must be excluded from controlling content is not new. This language that you see before you is the same that we've seen historically. However, the exemptions to the exclusion are now integrated into the standards, once again, supporting the intent of everything being in one document. Next slide. So as mentioned earlier, the proposed standards clarify that the accredited provider must review and sort through the disclosing individual's financial relationships to determine the ones that are relevant to the content of the activity. Something to consider is that this process may require resources currently not available to all providers, such as individuals with clinical or scientific backgrounds and or internet or web teaching skills. As we all know, many relationships can generate large lists of potential conflicts. So it's necessary, and again, the updated and proposed standards have made it clear that it's responsibility of the provider to sort through these and to identify and determine which ones are relevant and thereby need mitigation. Next slide. So standard 3.5 requires providers to include a statement when disclosing relevant financial relationships to learners, and that all financial relationships have been mitigated. This is new. However, we recognize that many folks already and currently do this. It's just clarified in the updated standards that it is a requirement that we make disclosure to our learners that the relationships have been mitigated. So now I'll pass it back over to Jan to cover a new exemption for self-directed learning.
So Standard 3 also creates an exception for self-directed learning. This is CE, where the learner is in control of the content and there are no planners or faculty. The example provided is a bedside case conversation among peers. When the point of care learning, doing point of care learning, in other words, when the learner identifies their own gap and need and is seeking out online resources to address. For these, there's no need to gather conflict or resolve conflicts or gather disclosure information. So we need to be clear here that we're not talking, and ACCME is not talking about when they mention case discussion, they are not talking about case-based regularly scheduled series or RSSs. We know this because the coalition held a meeting during the recent Alliance meeting in San Francisco, and we were privileged to have Kate Renier, the Executive Vice President of ACCME, join us for some Q&A on these standards. And we asked her if this was relevant to case-based RSSs, and she clearly said, no, it is not. It is really supposed to be based on point-of-care learning, which if you look at the latest statistics, or even the past couple of years of statistics from the ACCME annual report, POC learning or point-of-care learning is a growing trend. However, the last paragraph also indicates that while there is an exception for really self-directed learning, if this is point-of-care learning where the provider controls or recommends resources available to the learner, then the provider must assure that these resources, such as articles, books, monographs, etc., are not controlled, i.e. authored or produced by ineligible entities. This last part is not new, and it may require obtaining disclosure depending on what your sources are for this. Now back to Michael for a discussion of some new additions to requirements.
Thanks, Jan. I guess I'll call myself out here a little bit. Although I recognize that earlier I suggested we wouldn't share our opinions, I believe the proposed changes to Standard 4 about the receipt and disbursement of commercial support represent maybe the most notable changes and have the potential to be the greatest impact or disruption to many in our community. Consistent with the current standards, the accredited provider must make all decisions regarding the receipt and disbursement of commercial support. However, the proposed new standards state that the accredited provider is responsible for dispersing the commercial support. Personally, which seems to not align with the ability of the provider to make all decisions regarding its receipt and disbursement. So I think they contradict one another. But of even more significance is that the proposed changes state that commercial support used for honoraria or travel expenses of planners, faculty, and others in control of content must be paid by the accredited provider and not by an ineligible entity or, importantly, by a joint provider. I believe requiring the accredited provider to directly pay for these expenses, as opposed to allowing the accredited provider to give permission to a joint provider to pay the expenses, has the potential to disrupt many in our space in areas such as staffing, costs, and faculty satisfaction with timing of reimbursement. And so therefore, we're encouraging you to share comments and suggestions to uphold the intent of what ACCME is trying to protect here, but offer suggestions in ways that we can do that, maintaining the intent, but also allowing for administrative efficiency throughout that process. Given the potential significance of these changes, I'd like to hear what Jan and Tom might have to say or any further thoughts on this change, and then also Jan will cover Standard 5.
I think, this is Jan, obviously. I think we also need to think that it's not just affecting providers and joint providers, but this may cause some rethinking within the supporter community as well, and certainly will affect how budgets are prepared, because if the joint provider had previously been reimbursing for faculty expenses, that was probably in their management fee, which now would have to shift to the accredited provider. And Tom, I think you have a major key point to bring up in this regard.
Yeah, so our concern on this is just that we do a very detailed accounting back to the joint programs that we have, and we're both accredited and we do joint programs because we like to work with outside groups on accreditation and on partnerships. And so some of the universities we work with, for instance, have told us that they're not necessarily set up for the distribution of faculty payments and expenses on any kind of regular basis. And on top of that, that they thought that their dean would add a 30 to 70% tax depending on which institution we discussed it with. So that's kind of a concern to us. That we would be dean tax. In addition, we also work with various hospitals around the country, some of which want to accredit their own program, some of which we use our accreditation or our joint sponsors accreditation. And to be able to set up a new vendor in their system would be very, very difficult. Anyway, it would create a lot of, I think, angst from our faculty, but also from our participants. So those are kind of the main pieces, just the administrative piece. And we believe that there's probably a better alternative of providing a full accounting or some way in which all these expenses can be detailedly tracked and shared, including receipts if necessary for faculty expenses. So I think that's kind of the main point there.
Tom, did you also want to mention the dean's tax issue?
Yeah, I talked about it a few minutes ago that some of the institutions we work with have said that they would have between a 30 and 70% dean's tax in order to process payments to faculty, which would increase the cost of doing CME. So,
next slide. So Standard 5 talks about managing ancillary marketing around accredited education, and such as exhibits. And there's really nothing new here. It just puts things again in one place that have been in multiple places. Obviously arrangements for exhibits or this associated marketing cannot influence any decisions related to planning or delivery or evaluation of the content, interfere with presentation of the education, or be a condition of the provision of financial or in-kind support. Next slide. Standard 5 also gets into another one of the interesting and perhaps controversial parts of this, of the wording of these standards. The accredited provider must assure that that learners can easily distinguish between accredited and non-accredited education. Live continuing education activities, perhaps we should consider rewording that to be consistent with their new language and say live accredited CE activities for consistency must not occur in the physical space immediately before or after an accredited education activity and must not be interleaved within the accredited education. So what's immediately? What does that mean? How long a break or how long a time is necessary? In the previous iteration of when they first asked for comments on the existing SCS, we as a community, both the coalition and many other folks, asked for some clarity on how long this break should be, or what criteria one should use to establish the length of time that a break before or after should be. And so we would welcome your comments this time on how you might want to define or determine, if you're a provider, what immediately means. How do you determine that? And it might be different for a small meeting versus a large meeting where you have to clear a whole room before you can start the next thing. And then the next question, the next statement that we haven't read here, must not be interleaved within the education, the accredited education. The word interleafing is codifying a change that has occurred in interpretation and enforcement over the past couple of years. It appears to mean intermixing of accredited CE presentations or talks with non-accredited content, even if that content is labeled as non-accredited. In the past, it was a frequent practice that you could have a talk that was several talks that were CME accredited, and then have a talk that was not accredited and clearly labeled as such. And in the past few years, that's been clearly deemed to be mixing promotion with accredited education and has become a no-no. But so now the question becomes, what does interleafing mean? Well, when we looked it up in the dictionary, and each of us on the panel looked it up and tried, and I looked it up in probably about 5 separate dictionaries, and none of these definitions pertained in any way to the world we live in. They all talked about, they were all about publishing and blank pages and things like that. So we suggest that the word interleaving is probably not the correct word to use, and they may here need to spend more verbiage on explaining exactly what they mean, because the community will not understand necessarily what they mean in reading the standard. So then in talking about the immediate separation and the time issue, one question that came up in the last round of comments in 2019 was, does this requirement for separation by time allow for having such things as product theaters or promotional talk at lunch in the same room as the continuing education, if there is sufficient break before and after, and if the content of the lunch is, or the product theater is clearly labeled as non-CME, or is this interleafing? Because there is a break, there is a break before and after, but would this still be allowed in the same space? This pertains a lot to small meetings, where small one-day regional meetings, where you might have some exhibitors who want to do some promotional talks. Does that mean that you have to reserve 2 rooms, a separate room for this to occur? And what would that do to the cost of the activity and the choice of facilities and so forth that are available? Many hotels might not have room big enough to handle 2 separate meeting rooms at the same time. So the draft does not appear to give clarity on that. And B here, this portion relates to the delivery of education that is free of ads and is not new, except for the verbiage without having to click through. And again, in talking amongst ourselves, the panelists are not clarity on this. Is it like going to YouTube and being presented with an ad that you can click skip and go through? Or what is it that they're talking about here specifically? So we invite comments on that. Next slide. This is not a new requirement either, but it's been in guidance for some time, but this codifies it again within the standard. Pardon my phone ringing. I thought I put it on stun. As you read this, there may be some confusion caused by the wording, and it may be interpreted that schedules and logistical information are educational content, just by the way the subject is the sentence is constructed. And I would suggest that we need to have some rewording here, and your comments on rewording are welcome. Educational content or educational material, ACCME has in the past defined that as such things as the accreditation statement, disclosure, obviously things directly related to the content. So those things had to be separate and from any marketing or any material from ineligible entities, such as lanyards and bags with logos on them and things like that. And then the last statement here: ineligible entities may not provide preferential access or distribute accredited education to learners. This is not new. Again, it's just a restatement of a portion of the standards for commercial support that said that commercial interests cannot be involved in or cannot provide digital or electronic access to content. So if you have concerns about or are not clear about what that means, please do comment. I think we're okay. And then this last one. The accredited provider must ensure that learners can easily distinguish between accredited and non-accredited education. Okay, next slide. That's the same one we just talked about. Next slide.
Jan, do you mind if you can repeat about the click-through? I think you lost the audio at that point.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sure.
Repeat that?
Sure. The concern here is we're not sure what click-through means. as a panel, when we started discussing it, we're not sure what click-through means. Is it, for instance, when you go to YouTube, you might have to, you might have an ad presented that you can click skip and go through, or what does that mean? So we think that that term needs to be defined, or have more wording here to describe what it is they're talking about. So we invite your comments on that. With that, I turn it back over to Tom. I think we have time for questions.
Oh, thank you very much. No, we definitely have a lot of questions, and keep your questions coming in. And what we will try to do is, as much possible, is answer as many as we can. So we may run a little bit over, but we'll try to get to the ones that we think are the most relevant right off the bat. One person asked, did I see correctly, joint providers cannot make payments to speakers on slide number 22, which is standard 4. Jan, do you want to answer that one?
Could you just repeat that? I was just running over to get my phone so I could.
Okay. Sorry, I just said the joint providers cannot make payments to speakers according to the proposed rule. Is that correct?
Right. I'll let Michael answer that. The answer is yes. That's how it.
Are you there, Jan?
Yeah. Can you hear?
Okay.
Tom, can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Tom, yeah, and the answer is yes. That's what the proposed standard states, is that a joint provider is not allowed to pay for not only honoraria, but also expenses. And so again, we suggest that is something that you share comments about.
Tom, can you hear me now?
Oh, great. We are having some audio difficulty.
Yes.
Okay, Jan, people can hear you. I think we're losing Michael for some reason.
Can you hear me? Tom, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Okay. What concern does the ACCME have about their current practice when it comes to joint providers reimbursing expenses and paying honoraria?
I'll attempt to take that. Again, it's our role here is not to interpret their intent, but I believe there's concern about ensuring that the accredited provider maintain responsibility for the process of paying expenses and honorarium to faculty, and looking to ensure that those individuals actually do adequately get paid. And whereby, in ensuring that joint providers are not in a position where joint providers are not actually compensating faculty appropriately. I think that's my personal take on what's happening, where the intent is to ensure that providers are maintaining full accountability and not putting off their responsibilities to a third-party education partner. So again, in your comments, I think we should provide suggestions as to how we can uphold the accredited provider's responsibility through the process, whereby administering these expense and faculty reimbursements and the accredited provider maintaining control.
Very good. Would the accredited providers responsible dispersing commercial support, this also apply to dispersing in-kind or equipment and supplies?
I would say yes. It's the same. It's same disbursement and receipt of the support received.
In other words, the request needs. Yeah. I would agree.
Does the standard 2.2 also apply to HCPs that invented or own patents on devices that is discussed during an accredited education program?
I would say that patents and royalties have been considered to be mitigatable or resolvable conflicts in the past. They would not be owners per se.
Well, I think 2.2 refers to prohibiting faculty from marketing or selling their products or
Oh, yeah.
services.
Yep.
And,
So yes.
clearly, anyone that is a patent holder, has a clear conflict, right, and a vested interest in their products being sold. So, yes, the new standards would clearly prohibit that.
On the other hand, that person could be talking about a procedure. They could be educating about a procedure that they have. Oftentimes in the medical device world, the inventor of a new procedure also invents at times some of the medical device, or has creative input into some of the medical devices that may be used in that procedure. I'm thinking particularly of orthopedics, for example, where you may have an education activity that is talking about new approaches to doing, for instance, hip replacements and so forth, that may involve new products or whatever. So the person could talk about the procedure, but they could not advocate for the use of their devices or products in this. It would always be best if you could find another person to talk about that procedure, but the reality is sometimes the expert is the expert.
Sorry, our audio keeps coming in and out. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize. Can you, founder of a commercial interest? Okay. Jan, can you speak to the, or Michael, can you speak to the issues of a founder of a commercial interest speaking at an accredited CME, at a CME event, if the content of his or her presentation does not mention her company's product? And this is an issue that comes up frequently, and yet, as the previous slide said,
Well, I'm assuming you folks can hear me, and that might be audio.
Anyway, we're back. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. We lost our connection temporarily. I'll just mute mine.
Audio. Okay, so the chat room is saying that they can. The chat room is saying that they can.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we apologize.
The chat room is saying that they can hear us, but not Mike or not Tom. So let me take down the. Let me.
Jan, can you ask that question about a speaker from who owns a product?
Sure.
Not speaking about his own thing, but what is he?
Yes.
Is he able to?
Yes.
Speak?
Yes, I did, and I also heard your question about the founder of a company not speaking about, or on a program where his product is not mentioned or her product is not mentioned. The issue is not whether that product is mentioned, but whether the content of the activity, not just their presentation, that they are engaged in. In other words, and by activity, if it's in an annual meeting, it would be the session and not necessarily the entire meeting. But the content of the activity they are involved in cannot address the business lines of that owner's company or that founder's company. So it's not just that they're not talking about their content or their product, but that no one else in there can address the business lines of their company. In other words, that would be, for example, let me give you an example. I'll use urology. It's a favorite example of those of us who have been at PIM for a while. The urologist, there's a session on prostate cancer, treatment of prostate cancer. And the company that the faculty member has a conflict with is talking about hormone treatment of cancer, it has a conflict regarding hormone treatment of cancer. But the activity is about surgery related to prostate cancer. That person could speak about that, but they could not speak in an activity where you're talking about hormone treatment, whether or not you even mention the product of where the conflict is. Does that help make it clear?
Yes, it does. I have another question from an association. A non-accredited CME cannot be interleafed with accredited education. What does this mean? For instance, during our annual meeting, we have both CME and non-CME sessions. Does this mean we have to have a separate place for non-CME sessions?
This is Michael. I'll take this on. Yes, I mean, the intent is to protect the integrity and independence of the room where the accredited education is taking place. And so thereby the accredited sessions would take place in one space and the non-accredited in another. As Jan referred to earlier, we recognize that there are some venues that prohibit the ability to do that due to space. So thereby the intent is to ensure that there's clear separation between the two, and therefore there's an adequate break that takes place before the non-accredited and accredited sessions before and after. Again, I don't believe that personally that this is what they're speaking to with interleafing. I think it refers to it, but the interleafing more, I think, refers to if you have back-to-back sessions in the same room where session 1 and 2 are accredited and session 3 is not accredited, and then session 4 is accredited. So you've interleafed or interspersed a non-accredited session within accredited sessions without breaks. And I believe that's the interleafing concern, but clearly also there's the concern that accredited education is maintained, the integrity of that space is maintained, and non-accredited education takes place in a completely separate space.
Another question here we have is many speakers and CME providers interpret related, or this is about speaker disqualification of speakers, related to or relevant to the mean the speaker is talking about the products or services. One piece of ACCME guidance supports this interpretation. The ACCME considers content about CME and products or services that commercial interest to include content when the specific agent's devices, but not necessarily the classes of agent's devices, not necessarily content about the whole disease, etc. Can you clarify whether you think related to and relevant means when products of the company are discussed?
I think that might go a little too far into interpretation for the focus of this seminar. So
Okay.
I'm going to take a pass.
How does the change in recommending 2.3 affect sunshine reporting, if at all? And I would just say that I can answer this, and that for the most part, sunshine reporting is not. You don't report attendees, so it wouldn't affect that. So whoever asked that question would not be relevant. Are home health care agencies considered eligible entities?
Yes, they are eligible. They would be, unless they're owned or controlled by a commercial interest, they are providing direct care services, so they would be eligible.
Can a joint provider pay only for faculty or travel or planetarium? What about other venue costs like AV? Would the AP need to pay for these costs? Would the accredited provider need to pay for these costs, or is the activity has no commercial support? Is this standard non-applicable?
A couple of things. The proposed standards only speak to specifically the honorary and expenses related to those in a position to control content. However, the proposed standards, as historically in the old standards, make it clear that the accredited provider must be responsible and make all decisions regarding those disbursement. And on the second side about commercial support, this is just specifically related to commercial support funds. So therefore, I would make the assumption that it would be appropriate and allowable for a joint provider to pay those expenses that are not tied to commercial support.
In the interest, we're going to come back and answer questions, but for those who have to leave right at the top of the hour, we're just going to go through a couple other slides. One is, in summary, if you can read the whole document, you will see that areas concern you that you may have not been mentioned in this session. The proposed standards, here's a link to the proposed standards. The CME Coalition will also have our sample comments up by February 10th, so look for us to be able to send those to you by February 10th. The webinar will be archived on the cmecoalition.org, and we ask you that you provide your own comments to ACCME by 5 p.m. Central Standard Time on February 21st, which is the deadline. And when you do respond to them, give practical examples and propose solutions. So those who have to drop off, we appreciate you participating. Here's the contact information for the presenters, which will be included with the information packet that was sent out. And anyway, so we're going to go back to Q&A. Anyone who wants to stay on, we have lots and lots, and when I say lots and lots, I mean lots and lots of Q&A. Does one of the other questions on interleafing, since we're going down that road before, does interleafing mean not listing in an agenda, or even if it's after the CME portion, i.e. morning CME lectures, lunch break, and unaccredited lecture in the afternoon?
I just say again, I think it's clear separation between the accredited and non-accredited education. And I think we also look at intent. I think what was maybe suggested in that question is that you have the first half of your day might be accredited education and the second half of your day be non-accredited education. One, of course, first we would need appropriate separation. Secondly, it's hard to comment without knowing full details, but I would caution the intent of an activity that was designed in a way that half of a day is accredited and the other half a day is not accredited. Does that align with the spirit of independence and what we're trying to accomplish? But again, it's hard to fully comment without full details.
Okay. Couple other questions we have. It says, our hospitals already purchased new equipment, surgical equipment for orthopedic surgeons. And once installed, the physician feels they need training in how to use the equipment. Can this be considered CME if the company brings in an educator to explain and answer their question?
The answer is no. Training is often an FDA requirement of the producer of the medical device or equipment. It often is required as part of the approval, but because it's presented by the company, it is not eligible. However, if it would be eligible if, for example, you had a hands-on session where you had eligible faculty, those whose conflicts, if they exist, have been mitigated, doing the discussion and having the representative of the company only there to turn on, turn off, talk about, and actually do almost no talking, just handle the operation of the equipment, and having the eligible faculty talk about the procedure, the procedural aspects, including who and how and when to use it, but just perhaps having the company representative show, how to turn it off, how to turn it on, how to set, how to calibrate it, but not how to calibrate it in the sense of how to calibrate it to a specific patient. Okay. Does that help?
Do the new standards address when providers must disclose a relationship and how? Because currently it's before an activity begins.
That's still supported, I believe, in the current or the proposed standards.
It is.
Before they engage in the education.
Yep.
Under the new standards, joint providers may not use commercial support to make payments. That is the accredited provider's responsibility. What about using vendor revenue? Can joint providers pay expenses using vendor revenue? I don't know what that means, but I thought maybe you guys would know.
Not sure. Again, the standards, I think, are highlighting the disbursement of commercial support, but also not sure what vendor revenue means.
Yes. This one here says standard 4 will be a big deal as state grant funded, not for profit, since many of the joint provider hospitals have accounts set up for deposit and disbursement that track already set up? I don't think we need to answer that. I'm sorry, it's just, there's so many questions here, it's kind of hard. Can you speak to the difference between promotional versus non-accredited education, since several associations disallow accredited symposium, but allow non-accredited and accrediting enduring? That's kind of an interesting question.
I think, again, it speaks to the need for separation, between accredited and non-accredited activities, and maintain the educational integrity of the space where the accredited education takes place. I'm reading between the lines a little bit, Tom, and thinking maybe that the question refers to the potential of developing an accredited enduring activity based on a non-accredited activity. There's a lot of unknowns there, and was that non-accredited activity that the desire to endure, was that developed independent and in accordance and alignment with the standards or not? So again, there's a lot of things we don't know about that scenario to be able to fully comment.
Yeah, I agree with what Michael said, and I would say the basic question that you have to start with is, why did you not accredit the non-accredited portion? What was your reason for not accrediting it? Was it because of the nature of the content or the faculty, or were you making a fiscal decision, or why did you not accredit it? And if you can answer that it was worthy of accreditation, but for some reason you didn't, then to Michael's point, it becomes less of a problem. But you have to answer that question, and it's a complex question that requires lots of details.
Another one here is, we are accredited and own a procedural company that is not accredited but is an eligible entity. This procedural education does get in-kind support for some of the courses. Would we, the accredited provider, have to pay the faculty honorarium and travel expenses even though we own the procedural education company? I think that's...
If you're the accredited provider, the answer is, under these standards, yes.
Okay. When referring to disclosing relationships, is the proposal to maintain the language of commercial interest and non-ineligible entities? For example, if a faculty member has a potential conflict, is the potential conflict with the CI or IE?
Go ahead.
I think they're one and the same. It's nomenclature. I mean, a commercial interest is an ineligible entity, and outside of some minor word changes in the definition of a commercial interest, it has not changed.
And their intent is to abandon the term commercial interest. If you think about it, it is a rather pejorative term, and there are others besides those who we would think of as commercial interests that are in the ineligible list. So I think they're trying to clean up the landscape and say, we're not saying you're bad, we're just saying you can't, and we're not saying that your intent is bad. We're just saying that you can't be involved in control of content.
Another question came in. Are we able to comment on the proposed new terminology?
Absolutely.
That's the whole point.
That's very good. What's the time frame for these proposed changes to be adopted?
Well, the call for comment, again, is open until February 21st. And then the ACCME board will discuss the comments and so forth at its March meeting.
And then there'll be, and then if they're accepted at that point, ACCME will decide on a rollout period. In the past, they've used, for instance, a year for changes in standards, and up to 2 years actually at some point for changes in standards to be implemented. So they would establish that interim period during which providers would still adhere to the old rules, but prepare themselves to get ready for the new ones.
Related to standard 3.2, are they saying that industry scientists could not present as faculty at any conference that is accredited? Can you go through the exemptions that they provide later?
If the activity is related to the content of the employer of the industry scientist, the answer is no, they could not present, except for the exceptions that are listed there. There are some associations that have many industry members, and those industry members, for example, could talk about the regulatory process or talk about the basic science behind a new therapeutic approach, but could not begin to talk about any clinical trial results, for example, or clinical trial even design, those kinds of things, because they would have already, if they've already entered the for any other product, the approval process. So yeah, not just for that product, but for instance, a pharma company. If a pharma company would not be able to have a scientist talk about any clinical trial data per se.
Here's a question. I do a lot with diagnostic labs. If a diagnostics lab has an assay, is that considered a product?
Depends if it's proprietary. And if they market it and sell it.
Another here is that slide 4 says, does there remain an expectation that ads cannot be included in educational materials? I don't see verbiage anywhere, so would be able to start including our syllabi. I think they addressed that with the amount that you can't have it with the learning objectives, but if you guys can go ahead and address that, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any change that advertising cannot appear and be in educational materials. So it's about defining, what is educational materials. So information that includes objectives and or content, abstracts, disclosure information, that would be educational material. So it'd be not appropriate to include advertisement in that type of collateral. However, if it's collateral that just includes like an agenda with times and so forth and non-educational material, then it would be okay and appropriate to include advertisement in that collateral.
Someone asked me what a dean's tax was, and a dean's tax, for those who are interested, that's the tax that the university would add to the payment. So a dean's tax is just an extra 30 to 70% that they would add to a payment to a university. To any kind of payment that they had to put out. So I apologize for not saying that further. The one said, I'm a hospital provider and standard 4 can bring issues regarding anti-kickback statute. We have joint providers who are not affected by the statutes. If my organization will receive and disperse funds, then we're responsible for the CMS implications. Would we then be responsible for the CMS implications? I can say that there are possibilities with anti-kickback and also with START. And if you'd like to send me an email later, and I'll be glad to answer that question in more detail. Part of our guide that we're coming out with in a month will have a lot more details on those type of issues. So stay tuned on that one. And we have a lot more questions and appreciate, and they're still coming in, but in the interest of time, I think we're going to go ahead and end it. So we appreciate everyone participating. Again, our contact information is here. If you have any specific questions, by all means, reach out to one of the panelists. We will be sending out slides and audio of this to every participant. And so be ready to see that. In addition, there'll be an article in Policy and Medicine on this webinar coming up in the next few months. Any comments from Jan or Michael, just as a close for this?
Nope. We just encourage you to comment.
Yep.
Well, very good. We encourage everyone to comment. We thank you for your time today. Thanks.